Welcome to Lennox A-Push History, and today we're talking about a very important topic from period 3, and that's the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. So let's get started. We'll start first with some terms. My question to you is, are you familiar with all these terms here? Because this is the quintessential vocabulary list for this time period, 1776 to 1789, and it basically covers the transition of the United States from our very first government, the Articles of Confederation, to the U.S. Constitution and the form of government we have today. Now, that looks like a lot of terms. And my advice to you is, if you are good with about 80% of them, you're in a really good place. But if you look at some of this stuff and you're like, I don't know it that well, maybe it's time you start getting a little bit more into review. So my recommendation is pause this video right now, write down the terms you don't know, and then as I go through the lecture, you'll be able to key in on the things you need to learn and you need to highlight. Okay, so as we go into period 3, remember, period 3 goes from 1754 to 1800. We're just taking a small slice of that period right now and looking at the formation of our government. Initially, coming out of the American Revolution, or actually during the American Revolution, we had a federal form of government called the Articles of Confederation, and each individual state had their own individual government. So they're going to create their own our state constitutions. Now, these constitutions had some similarities to what we'll see in the U.S. Constitution. They had the idea of separation of powers. They had their own Bill of Rights, which, provided for our freedoms and protected us from the U.S. government. One specific state, the state of Virginia, actually instituted the Statute of Religious Freedom. And so that idea of being able to worship freely, whatever, religion you want, started to evolve at this point. Remember, during the colonial period, while some states were formed on the basis of freedom of religion, other states weren't. Think of Massachusetts. That was created by the Puritans, and they had a state religion throughout. And so in some of these state constitutions, you will see state religions initially listed. Now, that's going to be changed over time, but just keep that in mind as we're moving forward. Also remember that most of these state constitutions are based on this principle of republicanism, the idea that the power of government comes from the people. That goes all the way back to the Enlightenment period and natural rights with John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the social contract. The idea here is that the colonists did not feel like their voices were being heard in the British government. I think the term we used in class was virtual representation. That idea that just because you don't have a representative in government doesn't mean that your concerns are not being addressed. Well, the colonists didn't think they were, and they felt that they were just being overlooked. So when they created their state governments, and when we'll later create our national government, the idea is it's the people that gives that government power. And if the government's not doing their job, the people have the right to remove that government from power. So the Articles of Confederation are going to be the very first form of government you're going to see in our country. And there were both strengths and weaknesses. And let's be honest, most of the articles were weak. Our federal government was not strong at all. But if you look, we did have some strengths. For instance, when it came to foreign policy, our federal government had the power to negotiate treaties and sign those treaties. And if you think about it, that's pretty important considering that the Treaty of Paris of 1783 was signed and ratified by the Articles government. They also had the power to borrow money, also essential during the Revolutionary War because we needed that financial help to fight Britain. But the weaknesses, I think, over time totally overshadowed the strengths. We only had a unicameral legislature, which meant that each state, we only had one legislative body and each state just had one vote. So basically you had a Congress with just one house and 13 people, and that was it. There was no executive branch. There was no one to enforce the laws that the Congress was passing. And there was no judicial branch. Had there been any conflicts between the states that, were crucial, that had to be settled, there was no one in place or no branch in place to do that at the time. We talked about how the Articles had no power to tax. Taxation rested in the hands of the states, and the states collected the taxes they felt were necessary. But the federal government did not have that power. In fact, they were relying on the states to share their tax revenue. But we all know that's not going to happen, right? And then finally, they could not regulate trade. Trade is the quintessential cornerstone of our economy. And we're going to see that not only in the 1700s, but throughout the 18 and 1900s as well. And our federal government had no power to regulate that. It was the states who were doing that. And what essentially happened was every state negotiated their own trade agreement with other countries. And so in theory, France could have come and traded with America, but had 13 different trade agreements that they had to deal with. And what that's going to lead to is a lot of competition between the states to have the best trade deal. And it's going to actually start creating some division in our country as well. Our newly united country runs the risk of being divided over trade negotiations. Other problems, it was difficult to pass laws. You needed 9 of the 13 states to agree. That's what we call a supermajority. And then if you wanted to amend or change the Articles of Confederation, you needed every single state to agree to it. They needed to be unanimous. That's really tough in any situation, from deciding where we're going to go to dinner to running an entire country. It's very difficult to get everyone to agree 100%. Couple good things that came out of the Articles of Confederation had to do with westward expansion. The land ordinances of 1784 and 1785 are going to establish guidelines for how we will bring states into the Union. First of all, the land ordinance of 1784 is going to set floors for population numbers, meaning you have to have a certain population before you can apply to be a state. The land ordinance of 1785 is actually going to take new lands and divide them up. We're going to survey these lands and divide them into parcels and blocks and counties and stuff like that. And we're going to use that system to bring in or to divide up our states as we bring them in. One part of all these parcels of land is going to be dedicated for education. And then the government can look at the other parcels and say, okay, we're going to sell this as land that can be used for agriculture. We're going to set this aside for federal lands and everything like that. That was all decided with the land ordinance of 1785. And then finally, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 set up this system for territories to actually enter in the Union as new states. It went beyond the population, but it set up requirements such as having a constitution and having elections and stuff like that. One interesting part of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 is that it banned slavery. Now remember, to amend the U.S. or the Articles of Confederation, you needed a unanimous decision. In 1787, while the Constitutional Convention is taking place, the Northwest Ordinance is being drafted, it's being written, and the slavery question is not even a question. It was decided that all the states that came in the Northwest Territory would be slave-free. Now, on the other side of that coin, it's also recognized that everything south of the Ohio River, which is the southern border of the Northwest Ordinance, would still be slave territory. But it's fascinating to me that while we're debating should slaves count at the Constitutional Convention, at the Northwest Ordinance, convention, I guess, if you will, they're actually already have an answer to it. So interesting. While we're dealing with all this here, we're also dealing with our relationship with foreign governments. Now, remember, we do have the power to negotiate treaties, and we did that, for instance, with Great Britain. And in that, Great Britain promised to leave the North America territory that the United States had taken over. And Britain did not leave. They're still in the forts in the western part of our country, in that Ohio River Valley, going west towards the Mississippi. And they're disrupting our trade with the Native Americans. And we find out later that they're actually arming the Native Americans. If you remember, after the Battle of Tippecanoe, we found out that the Native Americans had all these British muskets. Well, where did they come from? Thank you, Great Britain, for not leaving North America. Spain, on the other hand, had just taken hold of all the land west of the Mississippi. They actually got that at the end of the French-Indian War, but they think they should control the Mississippi River. Well, as we move our settlers to the west, we rely on the Mississippi to get goods, to the Gulf of Mexico and up into the northeast part of our country. Spain bans American ships from going on the Mississippi River. So this is in 1784. So we're going to have to deal with that through negotiations later. France, they're the ones who came and helped us during the American Revolution, loaned us all this money. Surprisingly, they want their money back. And so they're looking for their loans to be repaid. And remember, articles don't allow for taxation, which means our federal government has no money. This is a problem. And finally, as we send our trade vessels out into the world, they're going to run into some pirates, the Barbary pirates that come off the coast, the northern coast of North Africa. They're going to start interfering with our trade in the Mediterranean. So that's another problem we got to deal with. But again, no military. So how do you deal with all these things? And these are just little precursors leading up to this idea that the articles just aren't doing their job. Probably the biggest event that's going to ignite our founders into saying we need to restructure our government is going to be Shays Rebellion. Shays Rebellion occurred when Daniel Shays, who was a former revolutionary soldier, comes home to Western Massachusetts and is facing mounting debt, facing an economic depression, and realizes that he is at risk of losing his farm. The creditors of Massachusetts are calling on the farmers to pay off their debt now that the war is over, but the farmers have no money. And so the creditors are starting to foreclose on their farms, take away their property, and in some cases arrest some of these farmers for not paying off their debt and putting them in jail. So Daniel Shays is going to form a coalition of farmers who are going to go to the Massachusetts state government and say, listen, we need your help. It's your job to protect us. So here's what we need. Number one, we need you to lower the taxes. We just can't afford to pay them right now. These foreclosures, how can we make a living if we don't have our farms? We need you to print a paper currency that we can use in Massachusetts to get our goods. We don't have hard currency. We don't have gold or silver. We don't have any of that. We need a paper currency. So we need you to do that. And finally, does it really make sense to put debtors in prison? Because once they're in prison, they can't work. And if they can't work, they can't make money. If they can't make money, they can't pay off their debt. So we need you to stop doing that as well. Well, the Massachusetts government is run by the wealthy elites, the people who the money is owed to. So they're very hesitant to say, oh yeah, we'll just do all that for you, Mr. Shays, no worry. In fact, they say, no, you owe a debt, you need to pay it. This is going to lead to the rebellion when Shays and his now army of farmers is going to march on the capital of Massachusetts. Now, Massachusetts does what any state would do. They call the federal government for help. Federal government can't help though, because it's too weak. It doesn't have the power to call up an army to go put this rebellion down. So that was kind of like the aha moment for a lot of people, that this articles government is not working anymore, and we need to increase the power of our central government. That's going to lead us to Annapolis, Maryland. Now, the Annapolis Convention of 1786 had two purposes. The first purpose was to discuss trade and commerce amongst the states. You see, earlier in the year, Virginia and Maryland had a disagreement over who had the right-of-way on the Potomac River. George Washington had actually invited representatives from Virginia and Maryland to his home at Mount Vernon, and they constructed the Mount Vernon Compact, which basically said that Virginia and Maryland would share the waterway, would share the Potomac River. And that is an indication that there could be problems ahead for other states. What if other states are arguing over rivers or other situations, or they're arguing over trade rights? They said that we have to come up with a system to deal with that. And so that's what the Annapolis Convention was really initially set up for, was to bring states in to discuss, any trade conflicts or commerce problems that they had. Well, with the Shays Rebellion, with everything else that's going on, it became a talking point at the Annapolis Convention is, you know what, guys, we really need to redo our government. So at that point, they decided to invite all the states to a convention in Philadelphia in 1787, where they would discuss amending the Articles of Confederation. Now, at the Constitutional Convention, 55 delegates from 12 of the states are going to show up, and they're going to realize that just amending the Articles of Confederation ain't going to do the trick. They need to rewrite this whole thing. So that's when they kind of ripped it up, threw it out, and said, let's start over. And they bring out those state constitutions. They bring out the Declaration of Independence and say, okay, we have some guidelines here. What can we use to build our government? And the Constitution is going to be born out of those discussions. But there's still problems. There's still conflicts, because the question of representation is probably, the overarching debate throughout this entire convention. How much representation should each state have at the federal level of government? In the Articles of Confederation, each state had one vote. And as far as the small states were concerned, that's a great plan. But the large states, such as Virginia, are going to make a different argument. James Madison is going to come up with the Virginia plan. And he's going to say that states should be represented based on the size of their population. He said, we have a lot of people living in Virginia, which means we have a lot of different opinions, and those opinions deserve to be heard. So we should base our representation on that population. So each part of the population has a voice in government. Well, the other side, the small state side, is going to come up with the New Jersey plan. And the New Jersey plan says, you know what, we might not have the population numbers that Virginia have, but our voices deserve to be heard just as much. And if you do it based on representation, we're going to be outnumbered every single time. And what this really boiled down to was whose voice was going to be heard. If you think about it, when we have like in-class debates, there's always seems to be one side that has more people. And those people tend to be louder, and they can very easily drown out the voices of those who are in the minority. And that's what New Jersey was afraid of. That's what these small states were afraid of, be that if you based it just solely on size, solely on population, the majority would always dwarf the minority and always silence them, to the point where the minority would never talk anymore, and all those people that are being represented would lose their voice in government. So Roger Sherman from Connecticut comes up with a great compromise. He goes, we can have both. He said, we'll have a bicameral legislature where the House of Representatives, which would be the lower house, would be based on population. That way, those states with large groups of people, all those different opinions, all those different viewpoints would be heard. However, we'll have an upper house called the Senate, and the Senate would have 2 senators from each state, equal representation. That way, the small states, while they're voicing their opinion in the House of Representatives, while they absolutely have a voice there, they're more likely to be heard in the Senate. And that way, everyone has a voice, everyone's voice is heard. And so that's why when you look at our government today, when you look at the legislative process, when you submit a law, it has to be passed by both houses. It can't just be passed by one. That way we're guaranteed that all voices are voiced and all voices are heard. So that was the problem. The Great Compromise, the Connecticut plan, is going to be accepted, and so we're going to be able to move forward with the Constitution. However, we still have the question of how do we count population? A lot of the smaller states were slaveholding states, and they still felt like they were not getting their voices to the congressional floor. So they asked for slaves to be counted as population. Well, the argument is, how can you count slaves' property as population? They are not voting members. They are not even seen as human beings. They are property. The compromise was this: 3/5 of slaves, or 3/5 of a person, would count towards representation. So that means every 5 slaves that were in, say, the state of Virginia, a large state, or the state of North Carolina at that point, a small state, 3/5 or 3 out of 5 of those slaves would count towards population. Doesn't mean those slaves got any type of civic rights or anything like that, but they are going to count towards population. The other side of that coin, though, part of the 3/5 compromise, which is often overlooked, is the idea that after 20 years, America would stop participating in the international slave trade. Over in Europe, that's already taken hold. Many countries over in Europe has already stopped. But with 3/5 compromise at the Constitutional Convention, we said we're going to put a 20-year moratorium on it. So in 1808, America will no longer be part of the international slave trade. The reasoning behind this is a lot of people thought that we were actually at this point in our history moving towards gradual emancipation. Many of the northern states had made laws to gradually end slavery in their states, whether it take 10 years or 100 years. That's the direction we were moving. And this was just another cog in that wheel, another way to reach that point of gradual emancipation. We never saw what was coming in the 1800s with the evolution of the cotton industry and stuff like that. In this moment in time, this is looking as a mechanism to move towards ending slavery at some point in our country. So you would think that would be that. All these compromises, everyone would be happy. But in truth, not everybody was. You had two groups that were looking at this Constitution, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Federalists said this is a good document. It gives us a strong central government. The Anti-Federalists are saying, no, it's way too strong. And such a government like that, with that much strength, is going to threaten our rights. It's going to threaten tyranny and everything that we fought against. That's what this strong government can do. In fact, we should just go back to the Articles of Confederation, because that is the style of government we really should have. And so you're going to have this battle between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And that battle is going to be fought out in a series of essays. The Federalist Papers are going to be written in support of the U.S. Constitution. Their authors include Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison. The Anti-Federalists, they're going to have their own set of essays, and they're going to be written by people like George Clinton and George Mason and Patrick Henry, and to an extent, Thomas Jefferson is going to contribute. We don't actually know who wrote exactly which Anti-Federalist essay. We do know the pseudonym they used, and all Anti-Federalist papers are written under the pseudonym of Brutus. So if you see that document come up with the name Brutus on it, that's an Anti-Federalist document. So you got to look at it from that point of view. In the end, there was another compromise, and it was this. James Madison agreed to add a Bill of Rights, much like most of the states had at that time, to the U.S. Constitution. Previously, the argument had been, if the states have a Bill of Rights, why does the national government need a Bill of Rights? But Madison relented. They're going to put in the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, and those rights are going to protect the rights of citizens, such as the freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly, all of that. It's going to protect citizens from the government, so you can't be falsely charged with a crime. You can't face cruel and unusual punishment. Your private property can't be searched without reason. And it's also going to protect the state governments. The 9th and 10th Amendment were put in place to protect the power of the states. So once the Bill of Rights is written, once it's promised, that's going to lead the Anti-Federalists to kind of step back and say, okay, and the U.S. Constitution is going to be ratified and become the government of our land. That same 1789, that same year, when the Constitution's ratified, we have our first presidential election, and George Washington will be the very first president to serve in an administrative capacity, an executive capacity, using this U.S. Constitution, and it's going to be put to the test right away. But anyway, that's it. That is the U.S. Constitution and how it was ratified. Hope that answers any of your questions. Again, if you have any other questions, feel free to email me and I'll be happy to answer it for them. I will also put a couple links down in the comments for this, some videos that might help you understand some different parts of this Constitution. So anyway, you guys have a fantastic day and we'll see you next time. Peace.